Our next data control topic has to do with privacy law. So we've looked at the basics of data control, the sort of key core terms. Let's look at the terms that are specifically responsive to privacy law. And unfortunately, this is not, we don't have time in this course to really go into either the very broad topic of privacy compliance or even the narrower but still quite large topic of figuring out what privacy law that applies to you, assuming you can figure out what privacy laws apply to you, figuring out what those laws require for your contracts. What I mostly want to do is give you some principles to think about in dealing with privacy law, some large scale issues to understand. And by the way, I also recommend that you consider privacy training, privacy legal training from IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals. We're not affiliated with them, so that's a recommendation without a bias, but that's a good place to learn about this at a pretty deep level. But let's talk about some basic issues about data control terms and what I call the mess that is privacy law. So here's a quick, very brief set of questions about what privacy law is. What is privacy law? A, an atascadero, which is a Spanish word for bog, quagmire, obstruction, stalemate, or place where horses and carriages get stuck. It's also, weirdly, a town in California. B, a train wreck. That was the picture I had on that first slide. C, a study in the misfit between territorial government and 21st century commerce. D, an attorney full-time employment conspiracy originating with the Illuminati, the deep state, or the people who really killed Kennedy. Or E, all of the above. And I think you're probably already predicting that the answer is all of the above. It certainly is C, a study on the misfit between territorial government and 21st century commerce, because we have a real problem. So basically, commerce has become relatively international, much more so than it ever has, and it is a continuing process. So a lot of us are doing business, particularly if we're doing business online, cloud computing type stuff, we're really doing international business. And yet we have a global legal system where countries make laws that apply within their own borders. This doesn't fit the world of e-commerce so well, and this is part of our problem related to privacy law. We have more and more laws from different jurisdictions that we have to think about because we're often not sure where the data we're working with is coming from. Whether you're the customer and you're providing data to the vendor, or you're the vendor and you're receiving data from the customer, or maybe as the vendor you're generating your own data, you may not know where it's coming from. And so much as you want to comply with privacy law, you don't know how, because you don't know which privacy laws apply. This is more complicated than you probably already know how complicated this is. So we've got GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. Applies to the data of European data subjects, but everybody's got to comply with it who gets some of that data, at least so the Europeans think. There's some gray areas around that. So do you have data subjects in your data set in Europe? Do you even know if you do? Are you likely to be subject to this? Maybe you have data subjects from somewhere else in the world and you've got to, in theory, find out what their privacy laws are. And then there's the United States, where there is no GDPR. There is no general privacy law. We have a bunch of federal level laws on privacy. HIPAA, Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, regulates health data, certain types of health data. We have Gramm-Leach-Bliley, financial data. We have all kinds of federal regulations that go here and here, but no broad, comprehensive privacy law. So the US states, as you probably know, have started enacting their own privacy laws. So you get more and more states with not particularly consistent privacy laws, somewhat consistent, but they're all writing their own laws. Are we doing business state to state? I mean, have you planted your flag in California and that's where you do business? Maybe if you run a store, but if you run a business that's operating online, by definition, you probably aren't. So how does all this impact our need to draft contract terms that address privacy? Because we really do need to do that. And mostly we're going to end up putting privacy-focused terms in a special document. Like if it's HIPAA data, it's the business associate agreement that you've got to sign when a health provider with this protected health information shares it with their vendor. Or with most sort of broad privacy statutes, it's the data protection addendum. So we probably have privacy laws that require that we do that. And in many cases, we're unsure what they are. And this leads to an interesting issue that comes up in contract negotiations. And this is sort of the core of what I want to get you to think about. A lot of times the vendor will be asked by the customer to agree to comply with all applicable laws. And sometimes a sophisticated vendor will shock the customer by saying no. By the way, this plays out in the opposite direction too, because the vendor doesn't know what all the applicable laws are. The vendor doesn't know where all the data is coming from. Now, a lot of customers' reaction to a no answer to will you promise to comply with the law is, oh gosh, I had no idea we were doing business with gangsters. I had no idea we were signing up with criminals. Let's just terminate right away. The good news I have for you is the fact that your vendor or that either party in the deal does not want to make that kind of promise does not mean that they're going to violate the law. Look at it this way. The law is the law. You don't need a contract to make the law enforceable. It's already enforceable. If you violate the law, you already have consequences. You violate privacy law, you probably have consequences facing, possible action by various government agencies. You might have litigation by injured data subjects. There's consequences, whether you've promised to comply with the law or not. If you promised in your contract to comply with the law, all you're really doing is piling on top of those consequences another one, breach of contract. So I'm here to give you the kind of counterintuitive suggestion that it's not necessarily a bad choice for someone to say, no, I'm not going to promise to comply with all applicable law or all applicable privacy laws. If you're on the customer side, there is one thing you need to be thinking about. Actually, both parties really need to think about this. There are specific privacy laws that are going to impose on you an obligation, a very direct obligation to make specific promises in your contract. Maybe in some cases you've got to actually promise compliance. Maybe you've got to certify, for instance, that you're aware of the applicable laws. So there is stuff that you will actually have to do. And if your vendor is refusing, or whoever's receiving the data is refusing to do that, that is a problem, because if you're providing the data to a processor, let's call the vendor the data processor, that hasn't made legally required promises, you have liability too. So yeah, there are times when you need to get the other party's concession, compliance, whatever it is, promise to comply with certain applicable laws, and you should pursue that. But there's plenty of times when it's not specifically legally required, and we've just got to be aware it's not crazy to refuse to promise compliance. It's a reasonable choice in some cases. And if you're particularly on the tech vendor side, I would recommend you think it through. And maybe you say something like, we're going to comply. We promise to comply with all applicable, all laws applicable to us in the jurisdictions where we operate, which are the following. And you're not making that promise about the laws that may apply to data from other jurisdictions. There's ways that vendors can sort of hedge this. Obviously, the less the vendor promises, the safer it is from breach of contract, not from violating the law. We can't escape that in this contract, but the safer it is. And the more the customer can get the vendor to promise, the safer it is. So don't imagine that this applicable law stuff, that it means that you are doing business with a criminal. This is really a complicated set of issues. The other thing to just keep in mind about privacy-related terms is there's so much focus on them that sometimes we forget that we actually have to protect our data. We have to protect our companies. So we ask Privacy Counsel maybe to write a data protection addendum that covers everything required by privacy law. I recommend an independent review of what the company needs the other party to do with the data. Your needs and privacy law requirements may not be the same. You may need protections that aren't in the requirements of the underlying privacy law, or that aren't sort of standard language that goes in the DPA. Mostly I'm saying don't turn off your brain when it relates to the data terms that you need to protect your own data, or the data terms you need to protect to your other side if you're holding their data. Don't turn off your brain when you get done with privacy law. There may be other things to think about. And what I'm really referring to is a lot of those data management and control terms that we talked about in the last chapter. So again, this isn't guidance, on that very long, complex topic of what terms privacy law is going to require go into your contract. This is meant to give you a sense of proportion and a sense of standards for how you want to approach this issue, particularly if the two sides don't seem to be seeing eye to eye. Another quick issue about this: why do so many companies promise in their contracts to comply with their privacy policies? You see the language over and over again. Vendor shall comply with its privacy policy posted at such and such. Sometimes it's the customer asking that. Sometimes it's the vendor offering that. A privacy policy is not a contract. It's not meant to be a contract. It's an announcement. In a privacy policy, you announce to the whole world, not just your contracting party, but everybody, this is what we're going to do with personally identifiable information that we receive. It's a notice, and there's no particular reason your contract needs to absorb that notice. And I'm raising the same concern, the same logic as I did on general applicable law compliance. If you don't comply with your privacy law, you very well may be in trouble, whether you promise to comply it or not, to comply with it, because you may have you may be pursued by government agencies. You may be pursued by injured consumers because you didn't do with their personal data what you were supposed to. Heaven forbid, class action. All kinds of unpleasant things could happen to you. You don't need to add breach of contract on top of that. Your contracting partner can look at your privacy policy and feel satisfied that it's there. It doesn't need to be in the contract. Sometimes the vendor, and I don't think this is a bad idea, will note the privacy policy in the contract, but mostly defensively. It will say customer is on notice that vendor's privacy policy is at such and customer has the opportunity to review. And customer is further on notice that vendor can change the privacy policy at will or according to the terms of the privacy policy. That's getting notice. It's sort of an element of consent to your privacy policy when you do something like that without actually promising to comply with it. So don't think of it as a contract document. It really isn't. All right, that's what I have to say about the mess that is privacy law. If you found this video useful, please come check out Tech Contracts Academy. We provide training on drafting and negotiating contracts about artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other forms of software. It's all for lawyers, contract managers, and any business people involved with contracts. So please come check out our programs live and on demand at techcontracts.com.